Hello again, and this time happy and blessed October 2022 from my small home studio here in Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. Exactly 40 years ago today, in what was then called West Germany, um, this happened 8 years before the two Germanys reunified. The official name of the country is now, as it was for the western regions of Germany, the Federal Republic of Germany. There was a change of the federal chancellor or prime minister, meaning the head of the federal government. After an intense debate of over 2.5 hours on the afternoon of October the 1st, 1982, which was televised and whose televised version I have watched or listened to many times, the most recent time was yesterday. 256 of the 497 members of the Bundestag voted for the motion of constructive no confidence against the incumbent federal chancellor Helmut Schmidt of the Social Democratic Party, and therefore voted to elect the Christian Democratic opposition leader Helmut Kohl. 235 parliamentarians voted against this motion, while 4 abstained, and the remaining 2 did not take part. At issue were the following matters. For almost 13 years, since the last week of October 1969, West Germany had been governed at the federal level by a coalition of the Social Democrats and the Free Democrats, the so-called Social Liberal Coalition. For the first 4.5 years, in other words, until his abrupt resignation in May 1974, due to the Günther Guillaume spy scandal, Mr. Guillaume was a high-ranking official of the West German Foreign Ministry and a personal friend of Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt. And then Brandt had already been informed in 1973 by Interior Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher of the Free Democratic Party that, according to one or more intelligence officers of the West German army, Mr. Guillaume was in fact an East German spy. Rather than start an investigation into the matter or possibly even fire or suspend Mr. Guillaume, Federal Chancellor Brandt acted in good faith, but in retrospect gullibly, and decided to do nothing concrete anyway. Eventually, on or around April the 24th, 1974, Mr. Guillaume was indeed arrested, and when he was questioned, he admitted that he was what that military intelligence report cited by Interior Minister or Federal Interior Minister Genscher had already claimed him to be in 1973 an East German spy. And obviously this was a major scandal because of the high degree of trust that Federal Chancellor Brandt had placed on Mr. Guillaume. According to the conventional rules of Western-style parliamentary democracy, such as the West Germany of that time, Federal Chancellor Brandt had the following options. He could claim that he had acted in good faith and that he had taken all the reasonable precautions, or that there had been no reason for him to suspect Mr. Guillaume of having been an East German spy, or he could have shifted the blame to the military intelligence services for not having prepared a more convincing report, or he could have fired or forced to resign a few cabinet ministers, including Interior Minister Genscher, or then he could have apologized deeply for having failed to exercise oversight and discretion and critical observation of Mr. Guillaume, but he would then have promised never to make any such mistakes again and to submit to a parliamentary inquiry into the incident. Or then, the last option was for him to take full personal and political responsibility for the incident and resign. He chose this option. And Schmidt, who had served in the West German federal cabinet since October 1969, first as the Minister of Defense, then as the Minister of Economics briefly, and then since December 1972, only as the Minister of Finance. He was elected, as expected, as Brandt's successor by the Social Liberal coalition government's majority in the Bundestag on May the 16th, 1974. Schmidt then proceeded to stimulate the West German economy amidst the first oil crisis, which had begun in October 1973, when, in retaliation at the material and humanitarian support which many Western countries, especially European ones, had given to Israel in its Yom Kippur War against Egypt and Syria, the Arab-dominated Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, had raised the oil prices considerably. And since this happened when most Western and indeed most other industrial or industrialized countries were going through a period of quick economic growth, it resulted in a high inflation coupled with a stagnant or barely growing set of economies. And many economists, or at least journalists, nicknamed this phenomenon as stagflation. So high inflation despite a low economic growth or low economic growth rate or no economic growth at all. Despite those economic problems, Federal Chancellor Schmidt was able to get re-elected in the federal parliamentary elections of West Germany, which were held in October 1976, but very narrowly. The Social Liberal coalition secured 253 of the 496 voting delegates or deputies of the Bundestag, compared to the 243 deputies elected by the Christian Democrats. Helmut Kohl, who had decided to enter the federal politics, having served for 7 years as the state premier or Ministerpräsident, meaning the head of the state government of Rhineland-Pfalz or Rhineland-Palatinate in the western region of West Germany, was the federal chancellor candidate of the Christian Democrats and their Bavarian sister party, the Christian Social Union. But thus he narrowly failed to get elected as the next federal chancellor. Why? Because the Free Democrats or Liberals decided to remain committed to Federal Chancellor Schmidt's coalition government. Kohl, however, got himself elected to the Bundestag and became the opposition leader there. He decided not to challenge the still popular Schmidt in the October 1980 federal parliamentary elections, not directly, but instead supported another Christian Democratic politician, but his Bavarian, at the same time, colleague and rival, the very sharp-tongued and strongly anti-socialist and anti-communist Franz Josef Strauss, who had earlier served as the West German Interior Minister and Agriculture Minister, and since 1978 had been the popular state premier of Bavaria or Bayern. a large federal state in southern and southeastern Germany. Mr. Strauss was able to defeat Kohl's favorite to become the Christian Democrats' candidate for federal chancellor. During that election campaign in the summer and autumn of 1980, Strauss tried but failed to convince enough West German voters to vote for the Christian Democrats, to persuade enough Free Democrats to switch their coalition partners. So Schmidt's candidacy for the federal chancellorship cost the Christian Democrats about 4.1 percentage points in terms of the party list or proportional vote. The Christian Democrats were still the largest faction or parliamentary group in the Bundestag with 226 voting delegates, compared to the Social Democrats who had 218 voting delegates. The remaining 53 delegates were Free Democrats. But as the re-elected federal chancellor Schmidt declared in October or November 1980 in his first policy statement of his third government, economic problems would deepen, and indeed I remember from around 1998 when I watched on Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's primary international broadcasting channel. It offers programs in at least English, German, and French, and or Spanish, unless I'm mistaken. During 1981, West Germany's unemployment rate at least doubled. This was part of the early 1980s recession, which affected tens of industrialized countries. It was partly caused by structural problems, partly caused by the growing economic competition and globalization, but also partly caused by the second oil crisis, which had begun in 1979 in reaction to the toppling of the autocratic Shah, meaning King and Emperor of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had fled into exile with his family, and the installation of a radical Muslim dictatorship known as the Islamic Republic of Iran, which was led until his death in June 1989 by Ayatollah, or Muslim religious leader, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. And according to a book written about the history of West Germany, entitled A History of West Germany by economic historians Dennis Bark and David Gress, Schmidt was on the verge of mastering those economic problems of inflation and unemployment and budget deficit when the second oil crisis again worsened the situation. The irony was that actually his social liberal coalition government had expanded its tiny 10-seat majority to a healthy 45-seat majority. But according to historians Bark and Gress, some 60 of the 218 Social Democrats who were elected to the Bundestag as the voting delegates, the ones representing West Berlin, were unofficial delegates whose votes did not count, for example, in the passage of laws or in the election or dismissal of the federal chancellor. So about 60 of those 218 Social Democrats were actually left-wingers. So this was more than the coalition's majority. And already since the late 1970s, there have been growing economic and other policy disagreements between especially the strongly pro-business right-wing faction or factions of the Free Democrats, and then the left-wing, more traditionally socialist factions of the Social Democrats. And Federal Chancellor Schmidt, who was a pragmatic, in other words, practical and results instead of ideology-oriented moderate social democrat, tried to juggle these tensions, but by the spring of 1982, it was clear that he no longer had an effective enough control either over his political party, the Social Democrats, which, by the way, he never formally led, because his predecessor, Willy Brandt, remained as chairman even after his abrupt resignation as the federal chancellor of West Germany, all the way until Brandt's retirement from active politics in 1987, incidentally the same year when Schmidt himself left frontline politics and turned into journalism, working as a columnist for the left-leaning or left-wing West German newspaper Die Zeit at the time. Because in the spring of 1982, it may have been in April of that year, there was a party conference of the West German Social Democrats, and during that conference, the left-wing delegates were able to persuade a majority of the conference's delegates to adopt a non-binding policy resolution to raise taxes on the corporations of West Germany so that more fixed-term jobs could be created for the West German unemployed. Schmidt himself, as a moderate and pragmatic social democrat, opposed the measure but was unable to prevent its adoption. And then in the federal cabinet itself, Schmidt increasingly found himself disagreeing over economic policies with the Free Democratic economics minister, Count Otto von Lambsdorff. And according to his English language Wikipedia biography, Count von Lambsdorff was humorously nicknamed Marktgraf, in other words, the market count. So even though West Germany was, as the reunified Germany is, a republic, the old aristocratic titles dating back to the time before 1919, when the first official Republic of Germany, the so-called Weimar Republic, was established, the old official titles, usually passing from father to son or from parents to children, they can be retained, but no new ones can be granted. And by June 1982, it was clear, according to historians Bark and Gress, that the social liberal coalition would break up before the next scheduled parliamentary elections that should have taken place in or around October 1984. The question was, when would the coalition break up? And then would there have to be immediately early federal parliamentary elections, or would the device of the constructive vote of no confidence, where a majority of the Bundestag's members simultaneously or at the same time votes out the incumbent federal chancellor or prime minister, meaning the head of federal government, and then elects the opposition's candidate for the new federal chancellor. At the state level, this device had been used already several times, and sometimes even by the Social Democrats. According to historians Bark and Gress, during those tense months of summer and early autumn 1982, Federal Chancellor Schmidt, who realized that his coalition government would soon fall, tried to make his party, the Social Democrats, look as innocent as possible and make the Free Democrats look as guilty as possible, because he himself assumed, this is my interpretation, that there would have to be then early parliamentary elections to resolve these political conflicts, this governmental crisis. So in late August 1982, when there were rumors of the coalition government's imminent collapse, Federal Chancellor Schmidt demanded that Economics Minister Lambsdorff explain to him his proposals for changes to the federal government's economic policies in a formal document. And it took Lambsdorff maybe a couple of weeks to complete a 34-page written essay or letter or report to the Federal Chancellor, which he then submitted on September the 10th, 1982. Schmidt was opposed to any kind of radical liberalization of the job market or any kind of notable or noteworthy cut in the social welfare spending, since after all the West German economy was in a recession, as were tens of other economies around the earth. And then sometime around the middle of September 1982, Schmidt became aware that a few major West German either weekly magazines or daily newspapers had privately promised to publish favorable articles about the Free Democrats should they decide to switch their coalition partners from the Social Democrats to the Christian Democrats. He decided to act quickly, as was his habit, and courageously or foolhardily, depending on the view. So on September the 17th, 1982, he bluntly gave the 4 Free Democratic cabinet ministers, including the already then long-time federal foreign minister and vice chancellor or deputy prime minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, 2 choices. Either they would resign or he would fire them. They decided to resign, and thus the almost exactly 13 years of social liberal coalition government came to an end. Later that day, in an unscheduled speech, Federal Chancellor Schmidt, who had become the acting foreign minister because the 4 then former Free Democratic cabinet ministers had been replaced by Social Democratic cabinet ministers on a temporary basis, and Schmidt's government had therefore become a minority government with only 218 deputies out of the voting 497 delegates in the Bundestag. He said, according to historians Bark and Gress, that after 13 years of working for the federal government, he did not feel glued to his seat. In other words, he was willing to step down. However, he was opposed to having the Bundestag elect Dr. Kohl as his successor because, in his opinion, the Christian Democrats had not shown enough leadership ability or profile, either in domestic policy or foreign policy. Schmidt then proceeded to ask for the second time in 7 months, he had first done this in February 1982, for a vote of confidence from the Bundestag, and he demanded early federal parliamentary elections to resolve the cabinet crisis. In other words, he was asking the Bundestag not to give him its confidence, as his predecessor, former federal chancellor Willy Brandt, had done back in 1972 after losing his effective coalition minority parliamentary majority due to several defections, most of them by Free Democrats to the Christian Democrats. So he was asking the Bundestag to deny him its confidence, but for the next 3 weeks not to elect a new federal chancellor, so that he could then ask the ceremonial head of state, Federal President Karl Carstens, to dissolve the Bundestag and call new parliamentary elections for December 1982. However, already 3 days later, on September the 20th, 1982, the Christian Democrats and most Free Democrats proposed Dr. Helmut Kohl as their candidate for the new federal chancellor of West Germany. And then the three official parliamentary parties agreed to set the afternoon of October the 1st, 1982, as the time for the debate and the vote on the constructive motion of no confidence against Federal Chancellor Schmidt. The debate was heated. Schmidt started it with a speech that lasted for slightly over 20 minutes. He accused the Free Democrats, particularly their chairperson, temporarily former federal foreign minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, of having betrayed the West German voters by having promised during the 1980 West German federal parliamentary election campaign to remain committed to the coalition until the 1984 federal parliamentary elections. And there were both Social Democrats, Christian Democrats, and even some Free Democrats who spoke in the debate. Incidentally, Mr. Genscher, who had spoken in the initial debate on the issue on September the 17th, 1982, simply sat at his seat reading some parliamentary papers and making some notes. The emotions ran especially high towards the end of the debate when Dr. Hildegard Hambrücher, a Free Democrat who had decided to remain committed to Federal Chancellor Schmidt, gave a strongly idealistic speech where she said, for example, neither should Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt be voted out of office without the voters' approval, nor should you, Helmut Kohl, be elected as the new Federal Chancellor without the voters' approval. Both devices, no doubt, are perfectly constitutional, or something to that effect. But they carry the odium of damaged democratic decency. So she was referring to the fact that in 1980, her political party had committed itself to continuing its social liberal coalition with the Social Democrats until 1984. And to the fact that still in February 1982, most Free Democrats had voted, including herself, had voted to affirm their confidence in the leadership of Federal Chancellor Schmidt. That they offended the moral integrity of the Federal Republic, or something to that effect. According to historians Bark and Gress, Kohl shouted from his parliamentary seat, "That's a scandal. It's a scandal that you call the Constitution immoral." So Kohl himself and one or maybe two other speakers then denounced Dr. Hambrücher's idealistic argument that the constructive vote of no confidence to replace Schmidt with Kohl without early parliamentary elections was somehow immoral. Schmidt himself commented briefly on Dr. Hildegard Hambrücher's speech. Actually, Hambrücher had, after finishing her speech, shaken hands with Federal Chancellor Schmidt, who was still sitting in his podium seat as the Federal Chancellor. And he commented that since the Free Democratic Party's leadership had essentially driven to internal opposition, such honorable, idealistic, although he probably didn't use these words, deputies as Dr. Hambrucher, who had decided for reasons of conscience not to support that party's decision to switch its coalition partners without new elections. It spoke about the illiberality or illiberalism of the party. And there was so much noise during Federal Chancellor Schmidt's second and last speech during the debate that he got angry and said that I have only 3 sentences to speak, and I ask you to read them out. I still have a right to speak here. When all was said and done, the president or chairperson, meaning Speaker of the Bundestag, Christian Democrat Richard Stücklen, then declared that the election would take place. Schmidt got up from his seat as the federal chancellor for the last time, and he dropped his voting ballot or paper in one of the 2 transparent glass boxes. And sometime later, the votes were counted. Speaker Stücklen announced the results. 256 had voted in favor. This number was then followed by rather long applause, mostly by the Christian Democrats and the majority Free Democrats, of course. Probably the others did not applaud at all. Then 235 had voted against, 4 had abstained. Already after the announcement of the new majority, who had then decided to terminate his career as the West German federal chancellor, Schmidt got up from his seat, parliamentary seat, and hesitantly walked over to the Christian Democratic side of the Bundestag chamber, shaking hands with Kohl, who commented in the document aired in 1998 about the West German federal chancellors that it was a very correct action for him to take. Looking very grim, Schmidt's predecessor Brandt also briefly congratulated Kohl. So, trying to sound polite, Speaker Stücklen, after having gone through the formality of declaring that the delegate, Dr. Helmut Kohl, or Deputy Dr. Helmut Kohl, had been elected as the Federal Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. I ask you, Mr. Dr. Kohl, do you accept the election? And then Kohl answered in German, Herr Präsident, ich nehme die Wahl an, or Mr. President, meaning Speaker or Chairperson, I accept the election. So Mr. Stücklen then congratulated the new federal chancellor, wishing him power and God's blessing, and then thanked the previous federal chancellor Schmidt and his government for their service to West Germany. So later that day, Federal President Carstens formally appointed Kohl as the new federal chancellor of West Germany, and then Kohl formed his first cabinet 2 days later. So, as expected, Hans-Dietrich Genscher returned to office as the federal foreign minister, and yes, Otto von Lambsdorff was reappointed as the economics minister, and so forth. However, the controversy over his election, even though it was perfectly constitutional. And as I said earlier in this video, several times at the state level, uh, it had been employed. In other words, several times state premiers or minister presidents had been dismissed through this parliamentary constructive vote of no confidence. So in December 1982, he decided to ask the Bundestag for a vote of confidence, and then he advised his fellow Christian Democrats and his new coalition partners, the Free Democrats, not to participate in the vote. 8 of them did anyway, while the 218 Social Democrats voted against. But during the next 3 weeks, no new federal chancellor was elected, and thereupon, in early January 1983, Federal President Carstens decided to dissolve the Bundestag and let the voters choose a new one to confirm Federal Chancellor Kohl's mandate. There were some people who appealed to the West German Federal Constitutional Court over the constitutionality of this device, because clearly Federal Chancellor Kohl was firmly in office, contrary to former Federal Chancellor Brandt in 1972, because Brandt had, by the spring of 1972, effectively lost his majority. Nevertheless, the Federal Constitutional Court, while somewhat criticizing the way in which Kohl had employed this constitutional clause, declared it within the bounds of the Constitution, and so the early West German federal parliamentary elections took place in early March 1983, which gave the Christian Democrats a whopping 48.8% of the proportional party list vote, for a total of, let's see now, 244 voting delegates out of 498. The Free Democrats paid dearly for their decision to switch the coalition partners, but they still squeaked by into the Bundestag, getting 34 seats, while the remaining number of seats were divided between the Social Democrats, who dropped to 193 delegates, and then the Greens, or environmentalists, who for the first time managed to clear the crucial 5% vote threshold to qualify for the proportional party list seats. They received 27 seats. Kohl went on to be re-elected with a reduced majority in January 1987, when his coalition, as far as I can remember, got 269 seats compared to the opposition's 228 seats. And then he was easily re-elected in December 1990, or just 2 months after the two Germanys had reunited. His coalition got 398 seats out of 662. However, the early 1990s recession, which was considerably deeper than the early 1980s recession and affected not just the Western industrialized countries, but many more other countries on the face of the earth, as well as the heavy economic cost of the German reunification, and the widespread or growing sense that Kohl should already have retired as the federal chancellor, all coupled to make that election campaign difficult. But the Social Democratic candidate for federal chancellor, Mr. Rudolf Scharping, who campaigned on the theme of social justice, nevertheless was unable to convince enough German voters to elect his expected Social Democratic Green Coalition government. And so the Christian Democratic Free Democratic Coalition was able to squeak by with a tiny 10-seat majority in the 672-seat Bundestag. In other words, they got 341 delegates compared to the Social Democratic Party of Democratic Socialism and Green opposition of 331 delegates. During the next 4 years, Kohl continued to guide Germany and propose especially especially domestic policy reforms, and to pursue a deeper form of European economic and political integration, something that he had already started during his first full term between 1983 and 1987 in close cooperation with the French president François Mitterrand, even though Kohl was a Christian democratic or center-right politician and Mitterrand was a socialist politician. Their friendship and professional working relationship were seen by many people as major contributors to the reconciliation between France and then West Germany, and since 1990 reunified Germany. Both of them supported, for example, the adoption of the euro as the new pan-European or pan-European Union currency. So he unwisely, in retrospect, decided to run for a record fifth term in office, or fifth full term in office in 1998. And although he tried hard, he was no longer able to inspire enough German voters to give him yet a new chance to govern them. And so the Social Democratic candidate for federal chancellor, who was then the Lower Saxony or Niedersachsen state premier, Mr. Gerhard Schröder, led the Social Democrats to victory. They actually became the largest single party in the Bundestag, while the Christian Democrats and the Free Democrats lost their tiny parliamentary majority. And the Greens decided to form a coalition government as expected with the Social Democrats. The remaining seats were taken by the Party for Democratic Socialism, the predecessor of today's Left Party. The Party of Democratic Socialism had been established in the wake of the German reunification, especially in the early 1990s. Most of its supporters were former East German communists or sympathizers of that party, the Socialist Unity Party. And so Kohl's active political career ended in late October 1998 when Schröder was formally elected by the Bundestag as his successor. He did serve out that parliamentary term, retiring in the autumn of 2002, but during that term he came under heavy criticism for the Christian Democratic Union's financial scandal, but he refused, claiming that it was his word of honor to name the donors who had given those controversial donations. So the rest of his life, he was in retirement. And also during his last parliamentary term, in the summer of 2001, he suffered personal tragedy because his beloved wife, Hannelore Kohl, who contrary to himself, was able to speak English and French fluently and assist him because, according to the first Mrs. Kohl's Wikipedia biography in English, Mr. Kohl himself spoke no foreign languages, or what I assume this claim meant was that he could not functionally converse in any foreign languages. So Mrs. Kohl, despite her linguistic talents and other fine qualities, suffered from a rare and potentially debilitating and very painful form of photoallergy. Some people, like probably psychologists and historians and medical doctors, have assumed that her very traumatic, even horrible experiences in the last months of World War II in the spring of 1945, when she, at the age of just 12, so she was barely an adolescent, was raped brutally and several times by certain Soviet soldiers. This was common practice for them because they wanted to avenge on the German women and girls, especially to a smaller extent on the German men, the atrocities that had been committed in especially 1941 in the western regions of the Soviet Union. And then at the end of those multiple rapes, she had been tossed out of the window, and she, as a result, suffered chronic pain in her neck and perhaps also her back or vertebrae. So it may have been a psychosomatic disease. Anyway, in the 1990s, it gradually grew worse, forcing her to wear wide-brimmed hats and dark sunglasses when she made public appearances. And starting in 2000, her condition became even worse. So she had to spend her days in darkened rooms, and then only at night she could walk outside. So by the summer of 2001, Mrs. Kohl became so desperate that she decided to commit suicide rather than keep suffering anymore. She left a suicide note in the form of a farewell letter. Mr. Kohl himself, who was for most of his adult life notably sturdy, even obese man, suffered a fall, and I think a cerebral hemorrhage, disabled for the rest of his life. Controversially, in 2008, he married his young assistant, Miss Maike Richter. During the last several years of his earthly life, he was at the mercy of his fellow human beings, confined to a wheelchair. He had to undergo some surgeries as well. Eventually, he passed away in the summer of 2017, aged 87, of natural causes. Anyway, he's 16 years as the first West German and then reunified German federal chancellor, constituted a German record since the establishment of the first official German Republic in 1919. That record was then tied between 2005 and November 2005 and December 2021 by one of his proteges from the former East Germany, Miss Angela Merkel. So, the last Soviet dictator, Secretary General of the Communist Party and eventually President, Mr. Mikhail Gorbachev, agreed not to oppose the German reunification as a part of the democratization and decommunization of Eastern Europe. And Kohl's policies ensured that smaller neighbors in Eastern Europe, such as Poland and the Czech Republic, became more confident that Germany would not make any territorial claims on them. Kohl grew up in a conservative Roman Catholic family. He was barely 15 years old when the European battles of the Second World War ended in May 1945. So he only was drafted and sent to basic training as a member of the Pitiful Volkssturm, or People's Attack Force, that consisted of teenage boys and old men. But the war ended before he had to fight. Therefore, he spoke of the grace of late birth. Die Gnade der späten Geburt, which caused some controversy in Germany, as one of my history professors lectured already back in 1993, I think. Kohl attended the Ruprecht Elementary School and continued at the Max Planck Gymnasium, which is the German equivalent of high school. After graduating in 1950, he began to study law in Frankfurt am Main, and he attended the lectures of, for example, Mr. Carlos Schmidt and Mr. Walter Hallstein. In 1951, he switched to Heidelberg University, which has existed since the Middle Ages, by the way. There he studied history and political science, becoming the first member of his family to attend university. After graduating in 1956, he became a fellow at the Alfred Weber Institute of Heidelberg University under Dolf Sternberger. He was active in the student society AIESEC. In 1958, he received his doctorate in history for his dissertation Die politische Entwicklung in der Pfalz und das Wiedererstehen der Parteien nach 1945, or in English, the political developments in the Palatinate and the reconstruction of political parties after 1945. In 1946, he joined the recently founded Christian Democratic Union, which was largely a follower of the former German Center Party, which was often called the Catholic Center Party because most of its active members and supporters were Roman Catholics, including Kohl's conservative Catholic parents, and Kohl himself was a Roman Catholic all his life. According to historians Bark and Gress, his personal Christian faith or deep religious faith left him with a conviction that politics was neither the highest nor the most valuable calling in life. And this attitude these attitudes, in their opinion, made him resemble the first West German federal chancellor, Mr. Konrad Adenauer, who had been in office from 1949 to 1963. In January 1955, he ran for a seat on the board of the Rhineland-Pfalz or Rhineland-Palatinate section of the Christian Democratic Union, losing just narrowly to the state's Family Affairs Minister, Mr. Franz Josef Würmering. But he was still able to take up a seat on the board because he was sent there by his local party branch. Bye-bye, as a delegate. And he was a moderate Christian Democrat. While he had his personal Catholic faith, he believed that the party should orient itself in a more humanistic direction and become less associated with the Christian churches, whether the Roman Catholic Church, the Evangelical Church, which is the major Protestant church in Germany, or other ones. In April 1959, Kohl was elected for the first time. He was aged 29 at the time, to the state legislature, or the Landtag. In 1960, he was elected to the municipal or city or town council of Ludwigshafen. And then in 1969, he was elected as the Minister President or State Premier, meaning the head of state government of Rhineland-Palatinate, as successor to Peter Altmaier. As of 2017, he was the youngest person ever to be elected as head of government in a German Bundesland. He was 39 at the time. During his 7 years as the Minister President of Rhineland-Palatinate, he acted as a reformer, focusing on educational matters. So his government abolished the right of teachers and other school adults to physically punish the misbehaving students. And he also abolished the parochial school, so religious schools, mostly Catholic ones probably. He also established the University of Trier, Kaiserslautern. He also finalized the territorial reform of Rhineland-Palatinate, standardizing the law codes and realigning districts. He established two new ministries, one for economy and transportation and the other one for social affairs. In 1973, he was elected as the new federal chairperson of the Christian Democratic Union, succeeding Dr. Reinhard Barzel, who had failed to unseat Willy Brandt as the federal chancellor, first on the non-confidence vote proposal in April 1972, and then in the ensuing early federal parliamentary elections in November 1972. He was still elected he won two general state legislative elections as the Ministerpräsident of Rhineland-Palatinate in 1971 and in 1975. But as I said, he narrowly failed to unseat Federal Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in the October 1976 West German parliamentary elections. And he wasn't the Christian Democrats' official chancellor candidate in 1980. In September 1984, he met the French President François Mitterrand at Verdun, northeastern France, where the Battle of Verdun, one of the deadliest battles during the so-called War of Attrition on the European Western Front of the First World War, had taken place between France, Britain, and Germany. Together, they commemorated the deaths of both world wars. The photograph, which pictured their minutes-long handshake, became an important symbol of French-German reconciliation. They also supported the establishment of Eureka, a research and development network of national funding ministries and agencies distinct from the European Union that fund and support collaborative international projects, and the Treaty of Maastricht, which entered into operation in 1993, establishing the European Union as the successor to the European Economic Community. In May 1985, Kohl and US President Ronald Reagan visited the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp and the German military cemetery in Bitburg. In the latter location, there was widespread outrage because of the latter visit, when the media reported that this cemetery had the graves of the notorious SS soldiers, but no Americans. Reagan, however, claimed that the escalating Cold War confrontations with the Soviet Union required his strong support for Kohl. So, true to his moderate center-right views, he presided over a number of innovative policy measures. He extended the unemployment benefit for older claimants, while the benefit for the young unemployed West Germans was extended to age 21. In 1986, a child rearing allowance was introduced to benefit parents when at least one was employed. Informal carers or caregivers were offered as an attendance allowance together with tax incentives, both of which were established with the tax reforms of 1990, and were also guaranteed up to 25 hours a month of professional support, which was supplemented by 4 weeks of annual holiday relief. In 1984, an early retirement scheme was introduced that offered incentives to employers to replace elderly workers with applicants off the unemployment register. In 1989, a partial retirement plan was introduced under which elderly employees could work half-time and receive 70% of their former salary and be credited with 90% of the full social insurance entitlement. In 1984, the Mother and Child Fund was established, providing discretionary grants to forestall abortions on grounds of material hardships. And in 1986, a 10 billion Deutschmark package of Erziehungsgeld, or child care allowance, was introduced. However, various studies later claimed that this latter initiative was heavily counterbalanced by cuts. However, his cabinets did also pass with the Bundestag's approval and the Bundesrat's approval as well. The Bundesrat is the indirectly appointed upper house of the German federal parliament. It represents the state governments. So the state premiers and certain cabinet ministers are entitled to sit as delegates. And it's a special upper house in that each state delegation, depending on the federal state population, there are either 3, 4, 5, or 6 delegates per state, for a total of 69 delegates. So each state delegation must vote unanimously either for or against each legislative proposal. If the delegates cannot agree, for example, because some of them belong to the federal government parties and some to the federal opposition parties, then they must abstain, which according to the English language Wikipedia has the same effect as voting against a proposal. So even though it's an indirectly appointed upper house of the indirectly appointed upper house of the German federal parliament, it is definitely a powerful upper house. It's not like the Austrian equivalent, which is also called Bundesrat or Federal Council, which can in most cases just delay the passage of the laws adopted by the Austrian federal parliament's lower house, the Nationalrat or National Council. Yes, student aid was made reimbursable to the state, while the Healthcare Reform Act of 1989 introduced the concept by which patients pay upfront and are reimbursed while increasing patient co-payments for hospitalizations, spa visits, dental prostheses, and prescription drugs. Moreover, while baby year pensions reform in 1986 granted women born after 1921 1 year of work credit per child, lawmakers were forced by public protest to phase in supplementary pension benefits for mothers who were born before the cutoff year. Somewhat controversially, in August 1987, Federal Chancellor Kohl hosted the East German dictator, the Secretary General of the Socialist Unity Party, Erich Honecker. This was the first ever visit by an East German head of state to West Germany, although this was generally seen as a sign that Kohl wanted to continue the moderate and conciliatory policies towards the East German communist countries, nicknamed as the Ostpolitik or Eastern policy, that had been introduced by his social democratic, one of his two social democratic predecessors as the West German Federal Chancellor Willy Brandt in the early 1970s. So following the breach or opening of the Berlin Wall in November 1989 and the institution of a reformist team of East German communist leaders, Kohl's handling of the East German issue became the turning point of his federal chancellorship. Like most West Germans, Kohl was initially unaware that the Socialist Unity Party was so weak that it was toppled in late 1989. First, in October 1989, the longtime dictator Erich Honecker was fired by the Politburo, or the political office of the Socialist Unity Party. He was replaced by Egon Krenz, a somewhat more reformist and moderate East German communist. But then came the breach of the Berlin Wall, which then increased the number of East Germans who voted with their feet and left that country. After all, the Berlin Wall had been erected in 1961, according to the official communist East German propaganda, as the antifaschistischer Schutzwall, or the anti-fascist protective rampart. In fact, its purpose was to block at least a great majority of those East German students and skilled workers and other civilians who wanted to leave this so-called model communist country, because they were tired of the repressive communist regime and the fact that, despite the fact that East Germany was actually one of the most prosperous ones of the communist countries, it was still considerably poorer than most Western democracies, including its Western neighbor, West Germany. So in February 1990, Kohl visited the Soviet Union, seeking a guarantee from Mikhail Gorbachev that the Soviet Union would allow German reunification to proceed. And he received that assurance. And then in March 1990, the first and only free parliamentary elections where the voters truly could freely choose between parties that were either cooperating with each other or competing against each other. In March 1990, those elections were held, and the Christian Democratic-led Alliance for Germany received almost half of the votes. Then on May the 18th, 1990, Kohl signed an economic and social union treaty with East Germany. And Kohl allowed a one-to-one exchange rate for wages, interest, and rent between the West German and East German Deutschmarks. In fact, in the so-called black market currency trade, the East German mark was worth much less than the West German mark. And together with Foreign Minister Hans-Dietrich Genscher, Kohl was able to resolve negotiations with the former allies of World War II, in other words, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Britain, to allow German reunification. A reunification treaty was signed on August the 31st, 1990, and at midnight Central European time on October the 3rd, 1990, East Germany officially was absorbed by West Germany, and its territory joined the Federal Republic as the 5 states of Brandenburg, Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, Saxony or Sachsen, Saxony-Anhalt or Sachsen-Anhalt, and Thuringia or Thüringen. East and West Berlin were reunited as a city-state, which became the capital of the enlarged Federal Republic. And then Kohl affirmed that former German territories east of the Oder-Neisse line that had been established in 1945 as the eastern boundary of Germany, which was then occupied by the Allies, the major Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, France and Britain, and Poland, was definitively, so Kohl vowed not to make any territorial claims to the east of the Oder-Neisse line in Poland, and already in November 1990 in Warsaw, the Polish capital, such an agreement was signed. In March 1990, Kohl had unwisely suggesting that a reunified Germany would not accept the Oder-Neisse line, but after the statement caused a major international backlash that threatened to stop German reunification, Kohl apologized for his comments and assured both the United States and the Soviet Union that a reunified Germany would accept the Oder-Neisse line as the final border between Poland and Germany. Furthermore, in 1993, Kohl confirmed via treaty with the Czech Republic that Germany would no longer bring forward territorial claims as to the pre-1945 ethnic German Sudetenland on the western border of the Czech Republic, and then, of course, Czechoslovakia. The Christian Democratic Union's party financing scandal became public in 1999 when Kohl was a backbencher delegate of the Bundestag, his 16-year federal chancellorship having ended in October 1998 with Gerhard Schröder's election to that office. So then it was discovered that the CDU had received and kept illegal donations during Kohl's leadership. Der Spiegel, a famous left-leaning or left-wing German weekly magazine, reported, it was never suggested that Kohl benefited personally from political donations, but he did lead the party financial system outside of the legal boundaries. So, according to Der Spiegel, Mr. Kohl opened secret bank accounts and established civic associations that could act as middlemen or procurement agencies for campaign donations. And while his domestic reputation in Germany suffered for some years after the financial affair, internationally he remained a widely respected elder statesman. Remembered for his role in solving the 5 great problems of his active political life: German reunification, European economic integration, the relations with Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union, and the Bosnian War. After retiring from politics and the Bundestag in 2002, he was largely rehabilitated by his party. So in late February 2008 began the truly uncomfortable years of his life, medically speaking. So he suffered a stroke in combination with a fall that caused serious head injuries and required his hospitalization. So after that, he reported he had to use a wheelchair because he was partly paralyzed and he had difficulty speaking. And while still in hospital in May 2008, he married his 43-year-old partner, Maike Richter. In 2010, he had a gallbladder operation in Heidelberg, and in 2012, a heart surgery. And in June 2015, following intestinal surgery after a hip replacement procedure, he was reportedly in a critical condition. However, in 2011, despite being in frail health, he started to give a number of interviews, and he began to issue statements where he sharply condemned his successor, Angela Merkel, who was then serving as the German federal chancellor, for her policies in favor of the strict austerity in the European debt crisis and later also towards Russia in the Russian-Ukrainian war. In his opinion, he saw those policies as being contrary to his politics of peaceful bilateral European integration while he had been the federal chancellor. He published his book Aus Sorge Europa, Out of Concern for Europe, outlining his criticisms of Merkel. He also attacked the Euro policy of his immediate successor by then former German federal chancellor Gerhard Schröder. He thus joined former German federal chancellors Gerhard Schröder and Helmut Schmidt in their similar criticisms of Ms. Merkel's policies in these two fields. In April 2016, he was visited in his Ogersheim residence by the controversial right-wing and self-described illiberal democratic Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. They talked for 1 hour and released a joint press statement regarding the 2015 European migrant crisis, saying they doubted that Europe was capable of continuing to absorb refugees indefinitely. In 2016, Mr. Kohl sued Random House, his former ghostwriter Herbert Spahn, and co-author Tilman Jens for publishing without his consent 116 comments allegedly made by himself during interviews in 2001 and 2002 that had been published in an unauthorized biography, whose publication, therefore, he had not consented to, in 2014, called Legacy: The Kohl Protocols. By April 2017, a German court ordered publisher Random House and the two journalists to pay Kohl damages of €1 million, or at the time $1.1 million for violating his privacy. This was the highest judgment ever rendered for violations of privacy rights under German law. Kohl was not terribly popular among the left-wing West Germans or reunified Germans because of his policies, and then he was mocked for his physical stature, alleged provinciality, simplistic language, and local Pfalz or Palatinate dialect. The German word Birne, pear, became a widespread nickname for and symbol of the Chancellor. While in small circles he was fascinating and a perfect host, he was not terribly comfortable in the large crowds. And his gaze into television cameras made him look helpless. However, when he was attacked, for example, during his numerous election campaigns, he did give the attackers a good fight. However, generally speaking, he was not a terribly inspiring speaker. Unlike many politicians of his time, including his predecessors Helmut Schmidt and Willy Brandt, and his successor Gerhard Schröder or his rival Franz Josef Strauss, he was never regarded as a very charismatic leader or terribly wise in dealing with the mass media. Nevertheless, he was a true people's person and loved to be in the company of others. And he had a sharp memory, at least before his final 9 years or so of life, about people and their lives. And that helped him to build up his networks in the Christian Democratic Union, in government and abroad. He has two sons from his first marriage to Hannelore Renner, Walter Kohl, born in 1963, and Peter Kohl, born in 1965. And as I said, his wife Hannelore, having suffered from photodermatitis for many years, in anguish, committed suicide by a drug overdose or medicine overdose in July 2001, aged about 68. Yes, Mr. Kohl died to scroll it up. Of natural causes in Ludwigshafen in June 2017, aged 87. So this is my video. I thank you very much for your patience in watching it, and I wish you a nice and blessed and successful, healthy, inspiring, and positively memorable October 2022 and time and life ahead.